Welcome to the Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave with another brief Bible study. Today we're looking at a passage in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. Have you ever heard of the Prayer of Jabez? I'm sure that you probably have. In the year 2000, there was a very popular book that was written by the title, The Prayer of Jabez, Breaking Through to the Blessed Life. It was written by Bruce Wilkinson. Very well-known book and a popular book, a bestseller. But what exactly is the Prayer of Jabez? Why is it that important, and what does it mean to you and I? The prayer itself is actually found in an historical note within a genealogy. There's really very little known about Jabez other than he was a descendant of Judah, and what we find in these two verses in 1 Chronicles chapter 4. In verse 9, it says, "Now Jabez was more honorable than his brothers." And even though we don't know much about him, what we do know really is quite extraordinary. We're told here he was a man of honor. That is to say, his life was characterized by integrity. In other words, he was someone that you could count on. He was someone that you could trust. He was a man of his word. And as a result, he was someone that you could respect and look up to. Needless to say, we need more people like this in the world today. In 1 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 55, it tells us that there was a town that was named Jabez, and most Bible scholars are in agreement that the town was no doubt named after this Jabez here in chapter 4. And when you consider his reputation as an honorable man, I would say that that's a pretty good guess that the town was named after him. It says, going on in verse 9, "And his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain." Again, we don't know a lot about him, but here we're given the meaning of his name. In the Bible especially, names meant something. And they didn't just name a kid just some random name. Oftentimes they would name them based on family names, but often the name would mean something. It would have special meaning. And he was named because his birth had been a painful one. And I'm sure that that story had been told. He, of course, wouldn't remember that, but no doubt he had heard the story, as probably many people watching this video have had their own mothers share stories with them about the difficulty of their labor or the ease of their labor or whatever. And so his name was based on the fact that his mother had given birth to him in pain. The name Jabez itself, or that word, actually means sorrowful or grief or sorrow maker. And so that's his name. In verse 10, it says, "And Jabez called on the God of Israel." He called on, or he called out, or cried out to God. There's a real sense of urgency that's expressed in his prayer. And this prayer really was with passion and purpose. And that sort of begs the question when we think about prayer. How urgent are your prayers? You know, for many people who claim to be Christians, they don't even pray at all. In fact, when they've done surveys, they've actually acknowledged that. How often do you pray? And the answer is, I don't pray at all, or very, very little. And that is one thing that would definitely make a big difference if more Christians would simply pray, let alone be passionate in your prayers like this prayer is in 1 Chronicles 4. The prayer of Jabez contains urgent requests for four very specific things. Number one, he asks for God's blessing. He says, "Oh, that you would bless me indeed." You know, Jabez understood that God was the source of all blessing, and so he asks God for his blessing. You know, not everybody acknowledges that God is the source of all blessing, but whether you acknowledge it or not, he is, and Jabez acknowledges that. This request for blessing was probably based, in part at least, on God's promise of blessing to Abraham and his descendants in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 17. That should certainly be part of our prayers on a regular basis. Lord, I ask for your blessing. And I'm sure that many of you probably do pray that. Lord, would you please bless me? Bless what I do. Bless my day. His second request was an expansion of territory. He says, enlarge my territory. So he's praying for success and that God would prosper him in all that he does, and that his life would be marked by increase, which, by the way, was a sign of God's blessing. And so he prays, enlarge my territory. Again, it sounds like a good request to me. You know, even though riches and prosperity can certainly pull you away from God, if you understand it and that it comes from God, as apparently Jabez did, it can actually draw you closer to God because you're acknowledging that those blessings are from him. And so I think this is a good request as well, success and prosperity, and most people would echo that. You don't hear people praying to be unsuccessful or, Lord, would you please not prosper me? And so I don't think he's doing it in a selfish or greedy way at all. His third request is for the presence of God's hand. He says that your hand would be with me. In other words, he's asking for God's guidance. And I think he's asking for God's strength to be evident in his daily life. And we, of course, need God's direction. Everybody does, whether they acknowledge it or not. But there's really a great deal involved in this request. If you ask God to guide you, then you must also possess the necessary faith to take the steps when God gives you direction. His fourth and final request was for protection from harm. He says that you would keep me from evil, that I may not cause pain. I find this interesting. The man whose name means sorrow and grief is asking God to keep him from being the cause of pain and suffering. Whether he's asking God to keep him from causing pain to other people or from breaking God's heart by sinning, either way, that's a really good request. Lord, please don't let me experience grief, or don't let me be the cause of grief to anyone else, which my name implies. Remember, Jesus taught his disciples to pray in this way in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 13, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And we know that the Lord won't lead us into temptation, but he will deliver us from evil. The final thing that we learn about the prayer of Jabez, it was answered. It says, so God granted him what he requested. So just like Solomon's humble prayer for wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 to 14, or Daniel's prayer for wisdom in Daniel chapter 9, Jabez's solemn and sincere prayer for God's blessing, God's success, God's direction, and protection was answered. The prayer of Jabez overcame the name of Jabez. It's a good prayer and one that we would do well to echo. Well, once again, thank you for visiting The Essential Truth. This is Pastor Dave. You have a blessed day and be a blessing to someone else.